Hey podcast family, welcome to CMXP2's Intersect Asia, where bold ideas meet insightful dialogue. My name is Dennis Susay and I'm a senior partner and co-head at CMXP2, a strategy advisory firm with deep expertise across several high-regulated sectors: agriculture and agri-food, food and nutrition, life sciences, and global banking and global markets. For today's podcast, it's all about ESG supply chain compliance. This is really a big deal for Asia's businesses that are supplying to their overseas business customers in the United States or Europe. In 2023, local and regional business media estimated that about 8 out of 10 Southeast Asia business suppliers stand to lose their existing EU and US clients because of ESG supply chain non-reporting and non-compliance. And yes, there are plenty of real examples of Southeast Asia companies losing their supplier contracts or having their goods impounded or seized at customs as a result of non-compliance and failure to report. In short, ESG supply chain compliance seems to be critical to business requirements for Asia suppliers. Let me introduce today's expert guest on this very topic, Grace Cheah. Grace is the authority expert in this for over the last decade. Grace has helped many large, medium, and small enterprises kickstart their ESG supply chain reporting and compliance requirements. Here's some high-level background on Grace, and let me get this right because she has a lot of good creds. Across Southeast Asia, Grace Cheah is recognized as being at the forefront of sustainability reporting, greenhouse gases accounting, and responsible sourcing. She is the founder of Sustinia Private Limited and Vista Lestari Sindrian Berhad, providing sustainability consulting and reporting services to both listed and non-listed companies across the maritime, utilities, property, and tourism sectors. Grace has also conducted external assurances on sustainability reports and integrated reports for various well-established companies in the region. Grace is committed to helping Asia's businesses and its boards build sustainability competencies. She has delivered executive trainings on sustainability reporting, sustainability supply chains, and carbon management. Grace is also on CMXP2's expert advisory panel called the Big Hats. So Grace is really the authority on supply chain compliance. Grace, welcome to today's podcast.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Now, let's kick off today's topic on ESG supply chain compliance and why it's such a big deal. For the opening, it's a bit of a two-part question. So A, ESG supply chain compliance for suppliers, which type of companies should be paying attention and why? And B, what's the risk of non-compliance?
First of all, let's look at ESG compliance and what it entails for companies. E stands for environmental, S stands for social, G stands for governance. So in short, a company is expected to have a holistic process in place, policies in place to implement ESG practices within their organization as well as the supply chain. So you can't push down these requirements to your supply chain unless you have them implemented firstly in your organization. Now, what are the consequences if you don't do this in your organization or your supply chain? You run the risk of losing your key customers. And these key customers are pushing down the requirements not because of their whims and fancies, but largely because of regulations in their own home countries or their jurisdictions, which require them to do so. So if your customers are from the US, they would have certain obligations that they need to fulfill. If they're from the EU, then there's another set of obligations that they need to fulfill with regards to supply chain. So the consequences of non-compliance are that you could potentially lose your customers. And in terms of growth, you can probably not think about having to venture out of this part of the world.
Wow, that's pretty severe. So you could lose your clients and you could not achieve
you won't
growth.
be able to grow, yes.
Yeah, that's a big one. So could you cite some examples of companies, there's no need to mention company names here, but that were impacted due to ESG supply chain non-compliance or non-reporting?
There would have been a couple of companies in the last few years that have been impacted by regulations coming from their key customers. And these regulations have affected the supply chain in various sectors, such as the agricultural sector, the FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, as well as electronics. So we have seen cases where companies have been working or hiring workers under certain conditions that are non-compliant with the US and the EU requirements. And when we refer to non-compliant, we are saying about things like forced labor, indentured labor, which is looking at fees paid to recruitment agents. In some cases, it could be companies who have forced their workers to work excessive overtimes. It could also include situations where workers are forced to live in inhumane conditions. So all these come under the broad category of forced labor conditions or indentured labor conditions. And when these customers find that the supply chain is doing this kind of practices, they will typically give warnings and time for the suppliers to clean up their acts. Should the suppliers fail to clean up their acts within a certain period of time, the customers typically would lose their patience and then decide to move away from them, terminate their contracts and move on to other suppliers.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty severe. So now the next question is a little bit more like for the CEOs who are listening and board members, trying to get them to help understand the technical, the reporting requirements. And this is quite getting under the hood. So it's a question around for Asia suppliers for emissions reporting. Say it's the United States. What are the requirements, the high-level requirements for emissions reporting for suppliers?
So in terms of the emissions reporting from the United States, we don't see as much of that as compared to the EU.
Okay, so maybe let's then delve a little bit into the EU. So more scrutiny from the EU?
Yes, we are seeing that there's actually a lot of interest coming from customers based out of the EU, in particular from certain sectors which are affected by the new regulation called CBAM, which is in short for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So this sector, this regulation actually puts a requirement on certain sectors such as the steel, the aluminium, fertilizers, hydrogen, electricity, to actually disclose the emissions associated with the production, the manufacturing, and the import of all these materials into the EU. So it's one way for EU to manage what we call leakage of emissions. They don't want an offshoring of energy-intensive activities to be done outside of the EU, and therefore they want to find a way to ensure that if such things are going to be imported into the EU, there's a certain amount of tax imposed on them. So for suppliers who want to import or rather export such goods into the EU, they need to provide data on the emissions associated with their products. If they fail to provide this information, their customers will have a big problem in terms of reporting to the regulators. And of course, it puts the suppliers at a disadvantage because if as a customer, I can't get this information from you, I would move on to another supplier who is able to then furnish me with the details I require.
Wow, that's really interesting and sounds like it's pretty strict in the EU.
It is.
Now, okay, let's switch over to labor reporting. So for suppliers, Asia suppliers looking at labor reporting requirements, let's look at the United States first. What are the high-level requirements there?
So in the United States, I think the key regulation that affects most suppliers is actually the U.S. Customs and Borders Protection, the US CBP for short. What it does is it prevents goods that have been suspected of being manufactured with forced labor, indentured labor, slave labor, child labor, and so on to be imported into the US. What this means is the US Customs and Borders Protection has the authority or power to stop your goods from entering into the country if they suspect it has been made with any of these. So as a supplier, you would have to actually do remediation and address the gaps or the findings before the goods can be released into the US. And we have seen that companies sometimes may have had to pay millions of dollars to reimburse their workers who were actually hired under indentured situations before the goods were released by US CBP.
Now, the US very strict. What about the EU? What's your take on it?
So the EU has a slightly different set of regulations. They have something called a due diligence, supply chain due diligence. And this is imposed on the EU companies of a certain size, and they are expected to implement a set of due diligence requirements on their supply chain to ensure that the supply chain, or rather the way the goods and services are procured, have been procured from, first of all, ethical sources. There's no forced labor, there's no bonded labor, there's no child labor, and so on. So the EU is taking a similar approach to the US, except that as of now, we have not seen any goods actually being confiscated or stopped at the borders yet. However, that being said, the regulations are changing so quickly. We understand that the EU is now also looking at imposing a similar regulation to that of the US, where if the goods are found or suspected to have been made under these conditions, it could potentially be denied entry into the entire EU.
Wow. Really interesting. Thanks, Grace. I mean, obviously, this is changes on a monthly basis. So
Yes.
keeping up with regulatory requirements is really tough. Thanks for answering that question. I'm going to kind of now move into a little bit around, what you do is your bread and butter and, your expertise. You help so many companies, on their ESG journeys. Most of them start off trying to, give you the call and they say, hey, you got to help us, save us, get our ESG supply chain compliance correctly done so that we can hold on and maintain our current clients. So after so many years of advising both large and small companies, many of them listed companies and some of them are smaller companies, what are the critical success factors, in your opinion, based on your experience, for companies kickstarting their ESG supply chain compliance requirements?
This question is quite tough. We normally go into an organization and we are typically called in at the last minute.
Yeah.
It's common. Right. And the first thing they'll say is, we have a customer that wants us to tell them what we're going to be doing. So can you give us a quick solution? And our answer to them is there's no quick fix to this because supply chain management is a long-term, it's a journey. So first of all, you need to have your team in place. Resources. Without the right people, without a team to manage this, you can't actually execute it effectively within the organization. I always remind my clients that the program will only get larger. It can't get smaller because year on year, you have more and more suppliers that you need to onboard. So in time to come, the program will just get larger and larger. So don't expect your resources to always remain status quo. I think you need to be mentally prepared for that increase in resources needed to manage this program. The second one, of course, is to have a process in place to manage the entire activities ranging from data collection to data analysis to managing your suppliers. So as you go about doing your due diligence, you will be sending out questionnaires to suppliers. You'll be collecting lots and lots of data. And data, when not analyzed or not being reviewed, is not going to be helpful for the organization. So you definitely need a process in place to manage all that information coming from your suppliers. And lastly, you need good leadership. And when I mean good, it means right at the top of the organization, someone needs to drive this down the whole organization. They need to get buy-in not only from their own team, but also from the suppliers. In some cases, you need the most senior person within the organization to also touch base with the suppliers because you need to get buy-in from the suppliers, failing which the whole program is not going to work.
Sure.
So having this kind of message from the highest person within the organization will drive the importance of this program to the suppliers. And, we hope that by doing so, the suppliers can see that this is actually a very important exercise and they don't take it lightly.
Yeah, well, that's great. I think we'll kind of visit the leadership, in the next few moments. But what about when you work with these companies and they start to see some benefits of ESG supply chain compliance, and then some of them may actually sort of get a little bit overboard because marketing is very important, communication is very important, and you have an assurance. You're credited as an assurance. You do to a lot of sustainability reports. So as an auditor, what's your recommendations when companies go a little bit overboard or maybe even greenwash some of the claims or exaggerate or overstate?
Okay, so I think first of all, we need to look at what information the company has gathered from their sustainability reports or from other sources. If this information is not publicly available and they claim that they have done this and that, it could be seen as greenwashing, especially if this information is not made public in the earlier years or prior years.
Yes.
So if a company is going to claim, for example, how many % reduction of emissions that they're going to achieve or how many % savings in terms of dollars and cents, it's good to actually have in place some documented information on how those numbers have been obtained. So while the marketing and branding can, of course, be sharing this in their brochures or or their advertisements and so on, it's good to actually fall back on some documented material.
Verified.
Yes, that's right. Showing that it has been achieved.
Okay, great. Now I'm going to come back, to the role of leadership, and obviously they set the pace. And sometimes not all leaders are on board at the beginning, but later on, you kind of shared with me a little bit off camera that the leaders come in on board later on when they start to see some real benefits and maybe some savings. So what's your take on the role of leadership in ESG supply chain compliance?
I think the role of leaders is really important, and I cannot emphasize it again and again that without good leaders, this can never happen. So we know that profit is important for a company, but without good leadership, you can neither achieve profit nor sustainable supply chain. Right. So the leaders have a very important role to play to drive the message, to ensure that the company is aligned on a common vision, that this is something that everyone has to partner each other on. So everyone, when I say that, means people from production to procurement to the legal team. And why are all these people involved? Because you will need procurement to work with the suppliers. You will need legal to carve in some of these requirements into contracts. Production will need to be involved because if a particular supplier has been found to be non-compliant and we now need to take out this supplier, will production be willing to move on to a different supplier? They now have to consider a different source of material and potentially do some testing to ensure that it still meets their needs. So you need an entire buy-in from the whole organization.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to do a lot of convincing, I'm sure, to board members and CEOs. But when it comes to the bottom line for CEOs and board members for ESG supply chain compliance, in your opinion, what should they be really thinking about?
I think they need to think about what's going to happen to the business in the next 5 to 10 years. Are we going to continue doing business as we are right now, status quo, with no changes to our customer base, no changes to how big we're going to grow or new customers that we're going to get? So if you are thinking of moving outside of Singapore, possibly venturing into the US or EU, or maybe even supplying materials or products to companies who then supply again to US and EU companies. Basically, you're part of that supply chain. If that is anything within what you expect to do in the next 5 to 10 years, then this is the time you need to start looking at your processes and thinking about whether or not it's going to meet the requirements of these large buyers.
Wow, that's really great. Thank you, Grace, for sharing those really valuable insights. If you're a CEO or board member and your company has or intends to have international customers across Europe or the United States, your company needs to get a firm grip on ESG supply chain requirements and reporting. It affects Southeast Asia and Asia suppliers, and there are plenty of high-profile cases of goods being stuck in customs due to the lack of ESG supply chain compliance. In a way, it starts compliance means to hold on to your existing clients, but as we have heard from Grace today, it also helps save considerable costs and provides a competitive advantage to win more international customers. It's really time to start your ESG supply chain reporting journey. With that, I'd like to thank Grace Cheah for taking the time to share her expertise and recommendations for the sector, and to all listeners for taking the time to watch today's podcast. If you liked today's content, please visit cmxp2.com.insights, like us on X and LinkedIn, and for all valuable insights, there's a ton more of material there. We thank you all for joining.